Hey, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Poison Pen Bookstore. We're here with our old friend John Billheimer, who's been coming back kind of sporadically since book one. A fellow book collector, and he's here to talk about two new books, really. The first is this book, nonfiction book, Hitchcock and the Censors, which is nominated for the Edgar Allan Poe Award this year, which is really, really terrific and thrilling. He has a little presentation. He'll be talking about that book. And then also the new Owen Allison mystery. It's been, has it been 13 years since the last one?
It's been 10 years.
10 years since.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very welcome return. We'll talk about what's going on in, in his world. But you'll be happy to know that I'm just going to kind of step out of the way for a while and let John do his thing. So let's give him a nice warm welcome, John Billheimer.
Okay, is this working? I don't have any faith in it.
Just got to hold it up a little bit closer.
All right, now it's working. Okay, that's okay. So I'm going to talk mostly about Hitchcock and the Censors because I've got movie clips to go with that, and I don't have any movie clips to go with my mystery. So I'll talk about how censorship developed in the U.S. and then eventually how it impacted Alfred Hitchcock and how he dealt with it. So let's just give you an example of censorship right here before your very eyes. Here's a scene from North by Northwest.
Is that a proposition?
I never discuss love on an empty stomach.
You've already eaten.
But you haven't.
All right, so what you heard Eva Marie Saint say was, I never discuss love on an empty stomach. What she actually said, and what you would know she said if you were a lip reader, is I never make love on an empty stomach. The censors couldn't stomach that. So Hitchcock had to loop over that dialogue. And that's kind of a trivial example of the kind of censorship he put up with, but he had an average of 20 comments, demands actually, from the censors on each of the movies he made in the U.S. And they ranged from the mundane to the mind-boggling. But he had to deal with each of them. And so I'd ask Joe, how did what turned out to be a group of 7 men in an office in Hollywood come to have that much power over the U.S. movies? And they reigned from 1934 to 1968. This slide shows you a little of what you couldn't see on movies. In the movies, you couldn't see women smoking, too much inner thigh, too much cleavage, a dead policeman, liquor, drugs, money, indicating gambling. Those are things that they were frowned upon. And how did that happen to be? How did that happen to be frowned upon, or how did these 7 guys get the power over people? What people saw in the movies? Well, when the movie started in the U.S. by 1921, there were these 5 states that actually had their own censor boards, and there was no consistency. So women could smoke on the screen in Ohio, but not in Kansas. You could show a pregnant woman on the screen in New York, but not in Pennsylvania. And when asked what censorship principles the New York board followed, its chairman answered, "So far, I haven't been able to find any." So you had this problem where when the state censors wanted to cut something out of a film, they just clipped it out. That was how they did it. And then the movie went on. If it went to enough states, it could be incomprehensible by the time it reached the 6th or 7th state. So the movie producers themselves said, we have to do something about that. We can't have 48 individual censors, or God forbid, the government censoring our movies. So they formed the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, this MPPDA, which is the forerunner of today's MPAA, Motion Picture Association of America. They hired a guy named Will Hayes to be its chairman, and they gave him 3 charges. He was to stem the rising tide of state and local censorship boards, improve the public image of the movie industry, and convince the public the industry could police itself. Well, he did pretty well about stemming the rising tide of state and local censorship boards. When he came on board, there was only one state that joined these original five. That was Massachusetts. They'd actually held a vote to ask the people whether they wanted censorship, and the people, as you might expect, voted it down. But the founding fathers in Massachusetts, the powers that be in Massachusetts, said, "Well, we've got blue laws, so we can invoke those." So you couldn't show the movies on a Sunday, and so in effect they had censorship over the whole week. So this guy Hayes also developed 13 points to try and convince everybody that would clean up movies. The problem was these were advisory only, and so because they were advisory, by the end of the 1920s, only half the studio scripts were submitted for vetting, and only about 20% of the finished films were submitted for approval. So those that followed Hayes' rules lost customers to the studios that didn't, and movies got hotter than ever. And that outraged a number of people, particularly outraged two who were, one was Martin Quigley, a publisher, and the other was Father Daniel J. Lord, a Jesuit priest. And so they developed a 4,000-word production code with the following general principles. You can read them, but all you need to do is read the first one. No picture should lower the moral standards of those who see it. Now that just covers an awful lot of ground, and they did cover an awful lot of ground with it. And so Will Hayes adopted that in 1930. He adopted this production code, but unfortunately it was still advisory. And the journalists at the time said, we've got a movie industry that's run by Jews and financed by Protestants and policed by Catholics. And it was true that the production code was developed by Catholics, but there was only, it really had very little to do with Catholicism, except that there was one aspect of Catholicism, and that was sin and redemption, that the producers took good advantage of. Right, here's a scene from The Sign of the Cross by Cecil B. DeMille, in which Cecil B. DeMille got around the production code by showing you 90 minutes of orgies and then 5 minutes of redemption. And that's what a lot of filmmakers did. You'd have 90 minutes of gangsters, and then the lead gangster dies at the end. And so that passed the production code. I'm not really sure what book of the Bible that scene is from. It's kind of tough to pin down, but it was from Cecil B. DeMille's movie. So they had that problem with censorship. They also had another phenomenon, and that was Mae West. Mae West came on the scene, and she had done a lot of stage plays. In fact, she'd been jailed for 10 days for one of her plays, which was called Sex, and was thought to be corrupting the morals of minors. And so none of her movies were thought to be filmable, but She Done Him Wrong, which was the first movie she made, was based on a stage play of hers called Diamond Will. And the Paramount had been warned that you couldn't film it, but they went ahead and filmed it anyhow. And here's an example of a scene from She Done Him Wrong, which Mae West is with the young Cary Grant.
I always did like a man in a uniform. That one fits you grand. Let's go up sometimes, see me. I'm home every evening.
Yeah, but I'm busy every evening.
Busy? Somebody you're trying to do with something?
Why, no, not at all. I'm just busy, that's all. You see, we're holding meetings in Jacobson's Hall every evening. Anytime you have a moment to spare, I'll be glad to have you drop in. You're more than welcome.
I heard you. But you ain't kidding me any. You know, I met your kind before. Let's go up sometime, huh?
Well,
Don't be afraid, I won't tell.
but,
Come up, I'll tell your fortune. You can be had.
So that's a little taste of Mae West. Paramount put $250,000 in this movie and made $3 million. So, and it was nominated for an Academy Award. So you can understand where Paramount went after that. They made a lot more Mae West movies, and that outraged a number of people, particularly the authors of the production code, the Catholics were up in arms. They formed a Legion of Decency, in which if you were Catholic, you stood up once a year in Mass and promised under pain of sin that you wouldn't attend any movies that they condemned. They developed a rating system, and so you hereby promise to remain away from all motion pictures except those which do not offend decency and Christian morality. And this really bothered the motion picture producers of America, because they thought, well, if the Catholics are starting to rate our films and boycott them, pretty soon the Protestants and Jews won't be far behind. So we really got to start taking this production code seriously. And they hired a man named Joe Breen, Joseph Ignatius Breen. He's a feisty Irish Catholic to enforce the code. And he, as I say, he was a tough guy. He was virulently anti-Semitic, which you'd think would be a disadvantage for somebody dealing with the motion picture producers. But what happened was he instituted the production code office. They started paying attention to the production code. And in order to have movies shown after 1934, you had to have the script vetted by the production code office, and you had to have the final film vetted by the production code office. And in order to do that, to have your picture shown, you had to have this little squid that was shown in advance of any movie that was approved. Now, they did that for about a year, and they started to notice people would boo this little squib. So they reduced it. They put it in the little corner of the credits, but you still had to have it in order to get your movies shown. And when that happened, there was kind of a triage. There were some movies, like the one on the left, Barbara Stanwyck's Baby Face, that were just withdrawn from circulation. Mae West's movies were allowed to complete their current run, but then they wouldn't be able to re-show the movie or sign any new contracts until they caught up with the production code demands. Most of the movies stayed in circulation, but what happened was, but in 1935, Mae West was the highest paid woman in the U.S. She made $481,000 per year, and she was the top box office attraction in Hollywood. After 5 years under the production code, Mae West was effectively out of movies, and the top box office draw was child star Shirley Temple. So that's some idea of how well or how much power the production code had when Alfred Hitchcock came to America in 1940. But he was no stranger to censorship. He'd been in Great Britain, and the British Board of Film Censors had their own version of the production code. They actually predated the American production code. They were more concerned with political and social issues than with sex and violence, so that they didn't want you to show scenes of people striking, for instance. They were more worried about that than anything else. And they had their own certificate, too, which was shown in advance of the movies that they approved. Too fast here. The British Board of Film Censors started with 2 rules, and by 1930 they were up to 98 rules. The people in the picture here are J. Brooks Wilkinson and Joseph Breen. Breen, you've already heard about. Wilkinson is Breen's opposite number in Britain. And he was a very hard-working man, very well respected. But he had one defect that you would have thought would have disqualified him. He was gradually going blind. And Hitchcock, he actually sat with the directors and would talk about what needed to be changed in films. And Hitchcock talked about working with Wilkinson. He said, I was sit beside Brooks, and he was blind in one eye. I would make sure that I sat on the side of his good eye. So if a dicey section of film was coming up, Hitchcock would turn to Wilkinson and say, Mr. Wilkinson. Wilkinson would turn to Hitchcock, and the blind eye would be toward the screen. So that's what happened to Hitchcock's British movies. We don't know exactly what happened, because the office of the British Board of Film Censors was bombed by the Luftwaffe in 1942. So all their records are the same thing didn't happen to Hollywood. So there's a Margaret Herrick Library in Beverly Hills that has all the correspondence between the censors and Hitchcock and vice versa. And it also has the correspondence between the censors in Hollywood and the British producers, because in order for Hitchcock's British films to be shown in America, he had to answer to the production code after 1934. So here's an example of a scene from one of Hitchcock's first big international hits, The 39 Steps. I'm going to show you a scene that the production code in Hollywood insisted be cut out. Now, because we've still got the British version, we know what was left in. And but here's a scene that was cut out. We've got Robert Donat and Margaret Carroll. They're fleeing from both cops and bad guys, and they wind up handcuffed together, spending a night in a country inn as man and wife. They share a bedroom, and here's a scene of them in bed that the production code in America insisted be cut out. If it's too much for you, you can feel free to look away. The two are fully clothed, they're handcuffed together, and they hate one another. So they barely exchange kind words, let alone anything amorous. But because they're in bed together, the powers that be at the production code couldn't stand it. Now, when the production code asked that the scene be cut, the British producers were up in arms. They said, well, then you've got this couple going to bed together handcuffed and waking up unhandcuffed. How do we explain that? Now, this is the part they really objected to. I'm sorry you had to see that. Anyhow, the production code held their ground, and this scene wasn't shown in America. It was just cut out entirely. And it didn't make sense because, they went to bed together handcuffed and then woke up unhandcuffed. So, let's see. By the time Hitchcock came to America, he'd been through a lot of their censorship. And the first movie he worked on when he came to America was Rebecca, a bestseller by Daphne du Maurier. And David O. Selznick bought it. Hitchcock went to work for O. Selznick. And David O. Selznick bought this bestseller for $50,000, which is as much as he'd paid for Gone with the Wind. And he showed the novel itself to the production code. The code reaction was, well, you can't film this. It violates the code on the grounds that it justifies and condones and does not punish murder. Well, Selznick went ahead and developed a script. And the code reaction to the script was they wouldn't approve it because the murderer gets off scot-free. There were inferences of sex perversion, and there was references to an illicit relationship and an illegitimate child. So at that point, Hitchcock stepped in and he thought, well, let's make the murder accidental. But I don't know whether you know the story here. You've got Maxim de Winter, who was a rich Englishman who was married to Rebecca, who died mysteriously, and in the book she died because de Winter had killed her and disposed of the body. And he marries a new wife who's a very shy person, doesn't even get a name in the movie or the book, played by Joan Fontaine in the movie. But Selznick, when Hitchcock suggested the murder would be accidental, he blew up. He said the whole story of Rebecca is of a man who's murdered his wife. Now it becomes the story of a man who buried a wife who was killed accidentally. And Selznick said, we bought Rebecca, we're going to make Rebecca. Well, he couldn't. They had to follow Hitchcock's suggestion. The murder is accidental. The murderer, the alleged murderer, Maxim de Winter, behaves just as he did when he actually did the murder. He gets rid of his wife's body. And it doesn't make any sense at all, but Hitchcock was clever and he got you by this problem. Here's a little bit of a long scene in which Laurence Olivier, who plays Maxim de Winter, explains what happened. He's explaining the accident in a flashback.
She was alone. She was expecting to, though, but he hadn't come. She was lying on the divan, a large tray of cigarette stubs beside her. She looked ill, queer. Suddenly she got up, started to walk toward me. When I had a child,
Hitchcock's doing two very clever things here. He's doing this flashback without ever showing you Rebecca. You never see Rebecca in the movie.
precious man. And she started to laugh. How funny. How supremely, wonderfully funny. I've been a perfect mother, just as I've been a perfect wife. No one will ever know. You ought to give it the thrill of your life, Max. To watch my son grow bigger day by day, and to know that when you die, Mandalay will be his. She was face to face with me. One hand in her pocket, the other holding a cigarette. She was smiling. Well, Max, what are you going to do about it? Aren't you going to kill me? I suppose I went mad for a moment. I must have struck her. She stood staring at me. She looked almost triumphant. Then she started toward me again, smiling. Suddenly she stumbled and fell.
So the other clever thing is not only doesn't he show you Rebecca,
Ages afterwards, it seemed.
any reader of the book will just assume the guy is lying because you don't see this. You just assume he must be lying because you know, if you've read the book, that he did it.
I remember
But
wondering when she was
as a
too
practical
small.
matter, in the movie, he didn't do it. He's totally innocent. He just behaves as if he was guilty. So the plot doesn't make a lot of sense. But it won an Academy Award for Best Picture. And Hitchcock was nominated for Best Director, which is an award he never won.
Anything.
So let's talk about another of here's one of Hitchcock's early movies, Notorious, which is one of his best, and which I think in this case the production code did him a good service. He followed their advice, and I think the movie profited from it. In the original script of Notorious, Ingrid Bergman plays a grossly immoral woman, a protest. She's a prostitute who's hired by the FBI to infiltrate a group of Nazis in Rio de Janeiro and find out what's going on with them. So the production code said, well, you know, we don't want her to be a prostitute. Neither did the FBI, who took their name out of the movie. So it's just some anonymous federal agency that's hired her. Just make her a gold digger, but not a prostitute. She's a woman who lives by her wits. And they don't want the federal agents to recruit her because of her loose morals. They want them to recruit her because the lead spy, played by Claude Rains, was once in love with her. And so her mission of sleeping with the enemy was distasteful. So instead of sleeping with her without benefit of wedlock, they have Ingrid Bergman marry the lead spy, Claude Rains. And although it sounds hokey, Rains pulls it off. He's just a terrific actor, and that's what happens. He marries Ingrid Bergman, and is eventually undone because she is a spy and revealed to be a spy. So I think in this case, the production code's suggestions actually help the movie. Here's an example of a production code that dictate that Hitchcock got around. The production code explicitly forbade excessively lustful kissing. Now, nobody quite knew what excessively lustful kissing was. The directors of the time assumed that means it can't last more than 3 seconds, or the lips can't be locked for more than most directors thought it was 3 seconds. One thought it was 5 seconds, one thought it was 10 seconds. Production code office said, we don't actually put a stopwatch on kisses. But the directors thought they did, so they might as well have. Here's a great scene from Notorious, which Cary Grant and Ingrid Bergman are on her balcony in Rio de Janeiro. Now, they exchange kisses, but the kisses, their lips are locked for no more than 3 seconds, so it's not excessively lustful. They never leave one another's arms. The whole scene lasts just short of 3 minutes. But there's no excessively lustful kissing, as Hitchcock understood the term. So he concocted this scene just to get around the censors. And it was a pretty hot scene at the time. It was commented on, but he could defend himself because he he concocted the scene with these short kisses just to get around the censors. And he liked the scene so much to get around the censors, he threw out the dialogue that the screenwriter Ben Heck had made, which was full of double entendres, and asked Grant and Bergman just to improvise. So they improvised by talking about what they're having for dinner. They're going to have a chicken dinner, and as you see, they're not leaving one another's arms. They eventually wander into her apartment and talk on the phone. And when the screenwriter saw this, he said, what's all this about a chicken dinner? I never wrote anything like that, but it's what Hitchcock had them improvise to get around the production code. The production code was very sensitive to language. Here's a list of some of the words and phrases that they had Hitchcock take out. You can see, you could imagine hell and damn would be taken out, but connubial and a thingummy and cripes were all excised. I need to explain the last two, arsenic and cyanide. You couldn't say arsenic and cyanide because if you said that, you were likely to give advice to potential poisoners in the audience. So they wanted you to just say poison. If you had a poisoner, you just had to call it poison. He couldn't say arsenic or cyanide. And they were the censors were so attuned to language, they actually got in the way of Cole Porter, who was the premier songwriter in America at the time. Here is Marlene Dietrich singing one of Cole Porter's songs that was heavily edited by the production code.
It's not 'cause I wouldn't, it's not 'cause I shouldn't, and you know it's not 'cause I couldn't, it's simply because I'm the laziest gal in town.
So that's from Stage Fright, and the lyrics you just heard, and it's not because I couldn't. Now the original Cole Porter lyrics were, and Lord knows it's not because I couldn't. According to the censors, they were taking the name of God in vain, so couldn't do that. He had to edit that. He had to edit a whole stanza, and he did all that willingly. But then the censors came to Porter and Hitchcock and said, there's something a little off color about this. We believe that what she's saying she couldn't or wouldn't do is sexual. Couldn't you arrange the lyrics so that it appears the things she couldn't or wouldn't do is housework or exercise or something like that isn't sexual? Well, they drew the line there, and so you get to see the lyrics as Cole Porter, or the idea behind the lyrics as Cole Porter intended them, and this became a staple of Marlene Dietrich's shows after that. And even though she didn't like the song to begin with. But now we come to the movies where Hitchcock really was on a roll, starting with Rear Window, which, if you don't know the story, James Stewart plays a wheelchair-bound photographer who's laid up by a broken leg, and he's looking across the courtyard in Greenwich Village at about a whole batch of apartments. He starts watching the people of the apartment and thinks that there was a murder in one. And the censors had a whole raft of objections to this. Mostly, they objected to the idea that there might be something sexual between James Stewart, the lead, and Grace Kelly, the female lead. But Hitchcock, in order to impress the censors with the idea that there's really nothing that they should worry about, he brought them to see the set. This set was all constructed indoors. There are 5 stories. There are 32 apartments across the way. 12 of them are fully furnished. And in fact, it was the largest set ever built indoors at the time. And in order to get the 5 stories, they dug so deep below the Paramount lot that they actually struck water. So Hitchcock brings the censors and shows them the set. And he says, look, we're not showing salacious close-ups of this woman who's dancing across the way or anything sexual across the way. We're showing the point of view of a man who is looking across the way, and we're not using close-ups here, and that mollified the censors to a certain amount. But once they saw the movie, they objected to at least three things. They objected to Miss Torso, the dancer across the way. They objected to her costume. They objected to Grace Kelly's negligee, and they objected to this honeymooners gag, which I'll talk about later. As to Miss Torso's costumes, Hitchcock did something that he, as he went along and got more confident and was more of a name in movies, he filmed Miss Torso's dancing three ways. He filmed her topless from behind. He filmed her in a white negligee. He filmed her in a black negligee. He showed the censors the cut in which she is shown topless from behind. And they said, well, you can't do that. Hitchcock said, apologized profusely and said, oh my God, I'll fix that. I'll refilm it. Well, he'd already refilmed it. So he took it back to him and said, okay, now she's in a white negligee, but if I give you this, you have to give me something. So he started bargaining with him, and he was very successful at it. Grace Kelly's negligee he managed to keep in because there were elements of the plot that were covered that couldn't be shown without her in view in the negligee. They also had this running gag of these honeymooners who moved in across the way, and you show them moving in, and then from time to time you'll see the husband coming to the window looking just beat, and then the wife calls him back to the bedroom. And the censors thought, well, if the wife's calling him back to the bedroom, there's something sexual going on. And so there's this ongoing gag where the husband would come, he would raise the shade, he would look beat, the wife calls him back, pulls down the shade, and that's just this ongoing gag. The censors divined that there was something sexual happening when the shade came down. So that this will be okay as long as he doesn't pull the shade down. We objected to the pulling down of the shade. And so here's a scene in which this is really almost a perfect movie, because you see what James Stewart's looking at, then they show you what he's looking at, then cut back and show you his reaction. A lot of the movie goes that way. And here's too quick again. Here's a scene with the honeymooners.
Look, Mr.
Now, you probably couldn't hear it, but if you listened closely, you would hear the sound of the shade coming down. He left that in, although he had to take out this. You're seeing the shade coming down. So the next film after Rear Window that Hitchcock made was To Catch a Thief. The censors just had a ball with this. There was excessive bottom pinching. This is filmed on the French Riviera with Cary Grant and Grace Kelly, and they were most concerned again about maybe there was something sexual going on between Grant and Kelly. So Hitchcock caught a real break here. Joe Breen, who we showed you at the start, who'd been riding herd on the code, developed lung cancer and was pensioned off. He was given an honorary Oscar, and about halfway through the filming of To Catch a Thief, he left office and was replaced by a man named Jeffrey Sherlock, who was much more refined, cut much more slack for directors he liked, and he liked Hitchcock. So a lot of these Hitchcock got away with, a lot of these original objections that came under Breen. There was one, though, that Hitchcock gave up in order to protect a seduction scene that he liked. There was an ongoing gag of two French gendarmes who were stationed outside the hotel where Grant and Kelly stayed, and they were while they were waiting for Grant and Kelly to come out, they were looking at dirty French postcards, and so that was the gag that Hitchcock just kept returning to, but they wanted him to take that out, and so he did that, but he took out the setup for the gag, but you've got the scene where the French gendarmes are following Kelly and Grant along the French Riviera, and they're looking at something. What they're looking at is the French postcards, but you don't know that because you'd lost the setup for that. Hitchcock bargained it away in order to get the scene that will come to you. You know they're looking at French postcards because it's 1954. They're not texting. They're ogling these postcards. Here's the scene that Hitchcock wanted to protect between Grant and Grace Kelly.
Never had a better offer in your whole life. One with everything.
I've never had a crazier one.
Just as long as you're satisfied.
You know as well as I do, this necklace is imitation.
Well, I've known.
The censors insisted that Hitchcock cut some of the dialogue. Originally, Grace Kelly said, ever had a better offer, one with everything, diamonds, excitement, and me. They cut diamonds, excitement, and me. And actually, I was talking about that. I should talk about the scriptwriter here, John Michael Hayes. He did Rear Window, he did To Catch a Thief, and he did Hitchcock's next two movies. The dialogue is delightful, really, and you could see some of it there. The censors still objected to the scene. They made sure that Hitchcock cut it before Grant and Kelly actually were supine on the couch. And they still wanted to cut it out. Hitchcock went to now Sherlock and said, you know, I think the problem you're having with this scene is that it was originally scored with a really sexy tenor sax. So that's the problem I think that you have with the scene. I will put some romantic strings behind it and it'll be much better. And so he did that, and they signed off on it. And when it's still a pretty sexy scene, but this is how he started to get around the censors. He would bargain with them, but he would usually get his way by this stage of his career. Let's go back. We started with a scene from North by Northwest. Here's a closing sequence in which the production co people actually added some more dialogue. We see Eva Marie Saint dangling from Mount Rushmore. And you'll see the actual end of the movie.
Now! Come on, I've got you. Up!
I can't make it.
Yes, you can. Come on.
Harder.
Come along, Mrs. Thornhill.
Oh, Max, this is silly.
I know, but I'm sentimental.
So the line that the censors insisted be dubbed in is "Come along, Mrs. Thornhill," so that you know now that Grant and Eva Marie Saint have married and it's okay for them to exercise their upper birthrights. And they did insist, though, that the angle between Grant and Eva Marie Saint and that upper berth not be any less than 45 degrees. So while they had their protractors out measuring the degree to which the Grant and Eva Marie Saint were falling toward the upper berth, Hitchcock put in this scene of a train going through a tunnel, which is blatantly phallic. He wasn't in the script. He just added it in and got by him. By this time, it was a game with him, and he was winning the game. I don't want to end talking about his movies, but it's important to talk about Hitchcock's movie, or Hitchcock's TV show. He had for 10 years, in the mid-50s to the mid-60s, he had this very successful TV show. It made him richer than all of his movies put together, and it made him a kind of a celebrity, international. And but in addition to dealing, the National Association of Broadcasters had the same rules. They modeled their rules on the production code, but you had another set of censors to deal with, and those were the sponsors. The agency sponsors of TV shows had a lot to say, and you know their advice was as picky, even more picky than those of the production code office. For instance, there was Chevrolet was sponsoring a show in which there was a line of dialogue. People were going to Ford a stream. Well, Ford is a competitor of Chevrolet, so we couldn't have them say that. So that was X'd out. And there were a lot of things like that. The makers of filter tip cigarettes insisted that all villains be shown smoking non-filter tip cigarettes, and vice versa. So the censors had, the sponsors had a lot to say about what went in the shows, and the production code rules were applied equally to Hitchcock's movies, and that became a thorn because if you remember any of these movies or any of these TV shows, they were half hour, later an hour, and they often involved criminals who wound up getting away. There was twist endings in which the criminals often wound up getting away with stuff, and they couldn't have that. Hitchcock got around that because if you remember the shows, he would come on at the start, tell you what the show was going to be about, and then he would come on at the end and tell you how things ended. If it appeared that the killer had gotten away with something, he would say, well, no, he didn't actually get away with it. The next time he tried it, everything went wrong. He went to jail. And here's one of his most famous Alfred Hitchcock Presents episodes. It's called A Lamb to the Slaughter, in which Barbara Bel Geddes plays a wife who kills her philandering husband, who's a policeman, by hitting him over the head with a frozen leg of lamb. She then roasts the lamb and serves it to the police, who come to investigate. So here's what's going on with that. Here she cooks the lamb. She's offering it to the police.
I tell you what, why don't you help yourself to some of this, too?
Well, we couldn't do that, Mrs. Maloney. Wouldn't dream of it. We'll be sending out for a couple of sandwiches in a little while.
Oh, no, now please. Eat this instead. I won't have to throw it out if you don't.
Well, what about you, ma'am?
Me? Oh no, I couldn't touch a thing, believe me. Give some to the others, too. They must be absolutely famished by this time, particularly those two standing out there in the cold. Ask them all in, why don't you, and give them a nice hot meal. It's very good meat, I promise you that.
The sound is about to go here, Patrick.
Boy, this is great.
This piece of meat I've had in months.
She said to finish it, didn't she, Jack? She did. I'd like to have a piece of this brown, crispy stuff left on the end here. Suppose it'd be all right to take this bone home to my dog?
Sure, she said you never want to see it again.
And her old man cooked it.
You missed a real good meal. Not so loud, fellas. Take it easy. Got any dope in this case yet, Jack?
Not a lot. No one's found a weapon. Doc says it's probably some sort of a club.
You mean like a shillelagh or something?
No, something heavy anyway. Must have weighed about 8 or 9 pounds.
And whoever did it, they're not going to carry a thing like that around longer than they need.
Personally, I think it's here on the premises. Well, for all we know, it might be right under our very noses.
Well, that's the way the old meatball bounces. As for Mary Maloney, she would have gone scot-free if she hadn't tried to do in her second husband the same way. Unfortunately, he was a forgetful type and had forgotten to plug in the freezer. The meat was as soft as jelly. Speaking of plugs, that is precisely what our sponsor wants to do for his product, after which I'll wheel back.
So that's how he got around the National Association of Broadcasters Code. He would come on and tell you that what you saw never really happened, or the killer was done in the next time she tried it. So let's see, I can't get away without talking about Psycho, because you can imagine this really gave the censors fits. They had a lot of objections to the script. There was evidently an incestuous relationship between Norman and his mother. Norman sees Marion naked through a peephole. This was before they even saw the shower scene. Once they'd seen the shower scene, they had, as you can imagine, even more objections. Let me show you a few of the things that were cut. Hitchcock decided to show this, film it in black and white, just because he thought it would just be entirely too gruesome if you saw the blood running in full color. Here's a peephole scene that was actually cut.
We did have a few problems with the censor. They sort of said they didn't like Janet and her slip in the beginning. And a few odd things like that, but we tried to...
So this is a scene that was censored. They wound up showing Janet Leigh in a robe in that second scene. And then, of course, you've got the shower scene. I'll show you its entirety. It's 78 pieces of film that Hitchcock's engaged in about harrowing 45-second, now you see it, now you don't. He filmed it specifically so you never see what was counted as nudity, and you never see the knife touching the flesh. But you think you see it. And that was all that mattered. It's probably the most famous, in fact it was voted the most famous individual scene in movie history. Yep. Not getting to it here. That's tough as shit. And you can see why he didn't want to film this in color. So, it really is a very powerful scene. You can imagine the censors' reaction. Hitchcock showed it to 5 men. 3 of the 5 claimed that they saw nudity. 2 of the 5 didn't see nudity, or anything counted as nudity. Hitchcock put the film back, didn't do anything to it, apologized profusely, gave it back to him, This time the 3 that had seen nudity didn't see it, but the 2 that hadn't seen it said they saw nudity. So Hitchcock said, well, look, you know, I'll take out the nudity, of which there really wasn't any. If you'll let me keep the bedroom scene at the beginning between Janet Leigh and John Gavin, which the censors also objected to. They said, no, we can't do that. So Hitchcock said, well, then we'll leave the shower scene as it is, and you come by tomorrow morning and I'll film the bedroom scene. You tell me what you want. And they didn't show up, so Hitchcock kept the shower scene and the bedroom scene. He actually had made 2 cuts in the shower scene. One was he cut it a little earlier than he wanted to because Janet Leigh blinked almost imperceptibly, and Hitchcock's wife caught that. The other thing that he had planned to end on an overhead shot where he draws the camera up and shows you Janet Leigh spread eagled over the edge of the tub, which did show what counted as nudity because it showed her bare buttocks. So he had to cut that. Aside from that, that really is one of the most powerful scenes you'll see in movie history. So Hitchcock got away with something there, but here's what he really got away with. This was something that had never been seen on screen since the production code started. Got to watch carefully. So you not only saw a toilet, you saw a toilet flushing. Now those things had both been outlawed by the code. They didn't like scenes in bathrooms. If you showed a scene in the bathroom, you couldn't show the toilet. And Hitchcock had run into this before in several movies. In one, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, he had a line of dialogue that was overrun deliberately by the sound of toilet flushing. Couldn't see that, couldn't do that, so he had replaced the toilet flush with some rattling pipes. And in The Wrong Man, where Henry Fonda is imprisoned, you saw him originally walking into a cell, and you saw the toilet in the cell. Had to reshoot it with no toilet in the cell. So, showing this toilet and seeing it flush was something that really hadn't been seen on the screen since 1934. Hitchcock got away with it, 1, because he was dealing with Jeffrey Sherlock, but 2, because it was essential to the plot. The piece of paper that doesn't get flushed is essential to understanding the plot. By that time, the censors were cutting Hitchcock more slack. So, in 1968, the production code was replaced by the rating system that's pretty much what we have now. So you would have thought that censorship was going by the wayside, but it really hadn't. In 1968, the same people who were previously censors became raters, and they were now rating the system. And if the directors or producers got a rating they didn't like, it was thought that an R rating would maybe cut viewership by 20%. They got a rating they didn't like, they would come to the raters, no longer censors, and say, what do we have to do to get a better rating? And they would tell them. And so the censors would, or the producers would respond. And so it sounds pretty much like censorship, and it still was. In the first year after the production code went down, the rating system looked at 314 movies. 1/3 of them had been changed in response to what the production code had asked for, and what the raters had helped them bargain away. So there was still, and still is, some of that going on. So I tried to make some sense out of this and sort of list what Hitchcock was willing to give away. He would give away dialogue. Dialogue he just didn't care about. He would give away logic. Logic to him was boring. He said that. And plot didn't really matter to him. What mattered to him was getting from scene to scene that he had envisioned. So if it didn't make sense, he would take you past the plot. Minor scenes he would give away, like the gendarmes in To Catch a Thief. If character may not make sense, he absolved Cary Grant of Guilt and Suspicion, for instance, when it didn't make a lot of sense. The color and the musical score, he would go in order to protect his visual imagery. So that by the time he was through, he had a lifetime of memorable films, and he pretty much outwitted the censors on most of them. So I'll stop there and ask if you have any questions about Hitchcock or Hitchcock's movies or censorship. Any?
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Jim.
Oh, there was a movie about Hitchcock and his wife that showed that she had a real important part in his movie making. Did she ever get involved in working with the censors or fighting the censors?
She was heavily involved, right up through Psycho. As I say, she actually had something to do with the background music in Psycho, and she was the one that said, "Oh, Janet Leigh blink." She was heavily involved throughout his career, through his British career and the first 3 or 4 movies he made in America. She actually got credit, sometimes as a writer, sometimes as just a credit on screen. So she was really heavily involved. Yeah.
I was just going to ask you kind of the effect of the war. What kind of effect did that have on the censorship of the time?
Well, I'm really glad you asked that, because I passed over it and shouldn't have. In Britain, in particular, as I say, they were more concerned about political things than the American censors. Right up to the war, you couldn't show Nazis, for instance, in a bad light. This is through 1938, 39. They didn't want to offend the German government. And because they didn't want to offend the German government, the Americans wouldn't show the Germans in a bad light. They eventually did. MGM finally had something like "I was a Nazi spy," because one of MGM's Jewish employees in Berlin had been chased down an alley and killed with a buggy. But in Hitchcock's films, running right up to the time he came to America, he had, in The Lady Vanishes, for instance, there are villains who are obviously Germans. Couldn't make them Germans, so Hitchcock invented a nation called Barovia. Barovia, these people were Barovians, they weren't Germans. So you wouldn't offend the German government. And then they had a lot of other, he had to respond to the Office of War Information. In Lifeboat, the Nazi U-boat commander that eventually takes over command of the lifeboat was obviously more competent than the Americans. That was Hitchcock's point. The Allies had to get together to overcome this guy. But the Office of War Information viewed it as Nazi propaganda, We could, without the soundtrack, you'd think that this is Nazi propaganda. And so that actually got, as a result of that, the Lifeboat didn't get nearly the play that it should have in the U.S. He didn't have to respond to the Office of War Information. It wasn't like the production code, but they had a lot of input into what went on, and in some cases, in Shadow of a Doubt, which is he called his favorite movies, there was a spending limit. They couldn't spend more than $5,000 on sets, and so he was forced to film it on site in Santa Rosa, and that really helped the film. It gave it a small town atmosphere. They went to great lengths to choose a house that would be the house that Teresa Wright lives in with her family, that her Uncle Joseph Cotton, who's a serial killer, comes to visit. They went to great lengths to choose this house in Santa Rosa, and they went and they bargained with the guy and agreed to pay him a certain amount of the house. So they showed up to film, and the guy was so happy to have his house in the movies that he painted it all and got rid of the effect that they wanted. So they repainted, and eventually came back after they filmed and painted it again.
Yeah, I mean, what I was really thinking was, I think it was Eddie Muller in one of his film noir. He talks about kind of the noir era, kind of the sort of golden age kind of coming in right after the war, and that a lot of these GIs, it's like the country had lost its innocence, and all of a sudden, a lot of the returning vets wanted to see more realistic, darker, grittier fare. It's pretty interesting stuff.
No, it is. It is. It actually started during the war. Maltese Falcon is kind of one of the first noir films, and that's officially recognized. There are all kinds of academics arguing about what is noir and what isn't.
Right.
But some of that was actually filmed during the war, partly because they were kind of bottom of the double bill, and cheap to film, and so. But it's true that there were the leaders in the movement were German expatriates who were filming it, and that was where a lot of the darkness came in.
Well, yeah, there's a new book coming out about all these German directors in exile, and I guess there were lots of them.
Oh, there were. There were.
You think about Fritz Lang,
yeah,
people like that.
yeah.
But this book looks really interesting. A lot of the actresses, and some of them barely made it out,
Yeah.
of Germany.
Yeah. And then you've got Billy Wilder and
Right.
others that are just terrific directors. Yeah.
Well, can you say a few words about Owen Allison and what's going on in this new book?
Yes, I can say a few words about Owen Allison. I don't have movie clips, but I do have picture of the Primary Target. Primary Target is the 6th book in the Owen Allison series, and I had abandoned it for a while and came back to it with a little backstory about where Owen Allison came from. If you know the books, he's a failure analyst. Why do trains crash? Why did this bridge fall? And so that gives him reason to probe into things that could be suspicious. He had a consulting firm in failure analysis in California that went bust because the governor of California took away a big contract from his firm, gave it to a crony, and Owen's firm never recovered. So he went to work for the federal government, couldn't stand that, and then went back to West Virginia, his hometown, and was a failure analyst. And working as a failure analyst, there wasn't nearly as much business as there was in California, so he winds up helping the local sheriff with a lot of accident investigations, for instance. Anyhow, that's the backstory. 10 years after his California firm has failed, the son of the governor who did him dirt is running for president. And the West Virginia primary is going to be decisive in whether the son gets the nomination. And West Virginia politics are, they're just, there's more corruption per capita there than any place west of Washington, D.C. The first time I became aware of it, I'm a West Virginia native, was the 1960 primary between John F. Kennedy and Hubert Humphrey, which Joe Kennedy openly bought for his son John. And in fact, Kennedy joked at the time that he'd gotten a telegram from his father saying, "Don't buy another vote, I won't pay for a landslide." And this was the attitude in West Virginia. Votes will buy. You could. I go into a lot of this history in the book. There's one county in West Virginia where the votes regularly exceeded the population of the county, not just the number of voters in the county. Votes actually exceeded the population of the county. And in that county, at one point, there were 200 absentee ballots that came in alphabetical order. So you can't believe this. You can't make this stuff up.
Dogs and cats are getting a vote.
Yeah. No. And so I go into that history, and Owen Allison now is in West Virginia, and he wants to keep the election honors. He's particularly suspicious of the son of this guy who did him dirt, so he's watching them carefully. And the first thing that happens is an aide to that woman goes missing, and an aide to the son, who is the sort of the villain of the piece, if there is one. He's the candidate. An attractive female aide of his goes missing, and the candidate is known to have a loose fly. So that's a problem. The Owen Allison's mother goes to vote, and finds that somebody has voted an absentee ballot in her name ahead of her. And then a campaign manager is killed under mysterious dies under mysterious circumstances. Best kind of circumstances to die under the mystery. And the mystery goes on from there.
Sounds very timely.
A spoiler alert, it all comes out all right. But it was fun just to do the excuse me, the research in the West Virginia's history, which is, as I say, you can't make up. Obama narrowly won what would have been the 2012 primary because he was running against a candidate who was in a Texas jail. The inmate polled 40% against Obama, but it was all legal. He had filed, and it was a protest vote, I guess. But there's just this history that's fascinating, and I tried to work into the book. So,
anybody have any questions? Maybe we'll break up and have you sign some books for us.
I'd love to do that.
And, thanks everybody for coming out.
Thank you all for
John a nice warm round of applause.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody on Facebook too.
Oh yeah, yes.
Was one of those words thingumpy?
Thingumpy, yeah, thingumpy.
What? Gumpy.
Well, that's interesting. I'm glad you asked about that because the thingummy was a word that in Lady Vanish's, the two Britishers had asked for a toilet. They were asking for a toilet in their room. And because they didn't want to say toilet, they said thingummy. But because thingummy referred to toilet, it had to be cut. I mean, you can't believe this stuff, but that's what happens.
Is that like freaking today?
It could be like freaking.
So
You could